Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in. Happy Wednesday. We have made it to the middle of the week and there is still a lot of action, especially in fantasy talk, also in betting talk as well. So we're going to do a deep dive into that. Should be a fantastic midweek episode to get us hyped, looking ahead to the weekend as well. We continue with looking at some pundits' rankings, analyzing them at the wide receiver and tight end positions this time. Also, kind of checking in on college football. It doesn't seem like we've had enough time to really look into the college football landscape that much. So we'll update you on the Heisman odds after 2 weeks of college football play. And then we're going to jump the gun a little bit, look ahead to tomorrow night's Thursday night football game between the Buffalo Bills and Miami Dolphins. Should be a good one. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. Everything you do for the network, especially me and my fellow podcasters as well, is greatly appreciated. And if you want to be more interactive, be a part almost, if you will, of the show, there are many ways you can do that, so avail yourselves to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features on YouTube. You can type in a comment in the chat. It will pop up on my screen, and I will read it aloud for everyone to hear, to share your thoughts, share your opinions, because that's what it's all about. I can share my own opinions, but I also want to make sure your opinions are heard as well, because I highly value them. They're what make this show even better. So continue what you guys have been doing these past couple of weeks as we have transitioned to a live show, and we will continue to get better as the weeks go on, as we get deeper and deeper into the fantasy football season. But without further ado, let's jump right into today's episode, starting off with, like I said, continuation of our rankings. We've looked at the QBs and running backs this past episode. Now we're turning our attention to the more skill position kind of players, wide receivers and tight ends. We'll start off in the world of the wide receivers. Again, this is not necessarily my opinion. I will in the future start giving more of my opinion on who I think deserve to be in the top 5, especially in fantasy terms as well. But at the end of the day, this is just a comprehensive list of 5 guys who will be there and thereabouts for the entirety of the season. They'll always be kind of in this core 5. Maybe we'll see some of these guys drop out, but I think this is a comprehensive list after week 1, even if they had some down games in there that a lot of people will respect. And so without further ado, let's look at this list. And we'll start at number 5 with a guy who I kind of told you about how this dynamic between him and his quarterback will continue. He's coming back from injury. Kind of sucks that the way that this came about, where he's now going to get more targets, is because of the injury to Puka Nacua. But Cooper Kupp, man, I told you that dynamic between him and Matthew Stafford is undeniable, and it paid dividends in this game. He will be facing Arizona this weekend, so look for him to get a lot of targets in what should be a rock fight of a divisional contest. But in that game against Detroit, 26 fantasy points as you see on my screen. He caught, I believe, 7 passes for 110 yards in this game for a total of 26 fantasy points. And in his career against the Cardinals, he's played many games, 6 touchdowns in 12 games, and has 815 yards. So one of his favorite opponents to play against. Look for him, especially now with the absence of Puka Nacua. We do wish him a speedy recovery here. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is, even with Puka Nacua, I still feel that, and forgive me, I apologize, I now remember there was actually 4 targets for 110 yards, so that makes it even better. Maybe not in a PPR sense, but in terms of his stat production and what he does with the ball in his hands. Cooper Kupp certainly pretends to be potentially in the future in these top 5 lists. I think he's kind of a pundit darling. In my humble mind, he is someone who I appreciate in fantasy, but then again, a lot of people believe the Puka Nacua hype, and they have started to kind of let Cooper Kupp fall to the wayside. So what I'm going to say to you is that if you do have Cooper Kupp, appreciate him for all that he does, because we never know what this Rams wide receiver core or what the Rams in general, as Andre says, Kupp is so back. Thank you for the comments. I believe that as well. It's unfortunate that it came about because of that Puka injury, but I do believe that dynamic between Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp, like I said, is undeniable, and it can't be overlooked in terms of fantasy implications. So Cooper Kupp deservedly taking the number 5 spot on this list. And then another guy that I want to talk about who played in this game, as Andre also says, never forget when he put up that legendary 2,200-yard season. Yes, I do appreciate that, but I don't know if you could see in the background, I am a Seattle Seahawks fan, so I have to take everything with a grain of salt, but Cooper Kupp is just a fun receiver to watch. Either way, many great seasons. Hopefully his best is not in his past, and going off what we saw in that game against Detroit, hopefully he's going to have as big a season as what his stats showed for that game. But let's get into our number 4 receiver, a guy on the opposite end of the spectrum, so to speak, a guy who did not have a great game, and someone who I personally had on my fantasy team, had great expectations for in this first game. I still think he will exceed expectations of what I think of him, and that game was not an indictment of who he was. Amon-Ra St. Brown. He only had 4.3 fantasy points in this game, 3 catches off 6 targets for only 13 yards as well. But I just think that it was a kind of game flow thing. The Lions and Ben Johnson were comfortable running the football in this game. They were comfortable playing smash mouth football and having the passing game be complimentary at best and serviceable at worst. It wasn't necessarily a pretty game for the Lions. They definitely could have won it easier, and Amon-Ra could have had a bigger impact, but still, a win is a win. You can go about many ways winning football games if you're the Detroit Lions. Going back to Amon-Ra St. Brown as a receiver, though, like I said, I still believe in him. I still believe that his first-team All-Pro season career high stands the test of time. And in this offense, yes, there are a lot of mouths to feed. There's a lot of ways you can distribute the wealth in this offense, and Ben Johnson is still kind of figuring it out. But at the end of the day, Amon-Ra St. Brown still is the wide receiver one. He's still, if the Lions are focused on a game plan that opens up the field more and gets more involved in the passing game, then Amon-Ra St. Brown will always be the first to look. He'll always be the first option. And Jared Goff knows that. As Andre, kudos to Andre here for all these comments flooding in. I believe still, but I think if the Lions notice somebody can't stop the run, they'll continue to do what they did against the Rams. That O-line is so elite. That's another big factor. Thank you for that comment. That is a fantastic point from you, Andre. That O-line really is built to sustain whatever game plan Ben Johnson lays out. Because we saw, like Andre alluded to in this game, the power of that running game. They rode David Montgomery, and it paid dividends in the end. And this game against the Bucs could be very similar, because the Bucs are a team that really is transitioning into a top 10 defense in my mind. I think that they can reach that echelon. I think the Bucs are underrated defense, and they have a very stout front seven. That secondary, yes, is very scary. They have Antoine Winfield Jr. in that secondary. They have so many different pieces. But at the end of the day, you might want to consider doing what you did against the Rams, because David Montgomery will ease kind of the pass rush. And also, that could open up many more avenues for Jared Goff underneath. And Amon-Ra St. Brown, what I love about him is he's very fascinating to watch when he works underneath. He's not someone who just always goes vertical. He knows how to run routes. He's very intelligent in that aspect, in that regard. And so still look for him. This game, like I said, was not a true embodiment of who Amon-Ra St. Brown is, and I expect him to bounce back, have a very similar season to what he'd had last year, and he will deserve the plaudits that will carry over to this year from last year. But going on to number 3, this is a guy who I also expect to get more comfortable as the season goes on. Didn't necessarily have a terrible game, but it wasn't, quote-unquote, impressive for this guy, and that is CeeDee Lamb. Now, the flow of this game for both teams, more so specifically for Dallas, was weird in the sense that, yes, I liked what I saw out of their offense, but it wasn't necessarily the prettiest way to go about it, if you know what I mean. I still think that this Dallas offense is getting underrated, but at the end of the day, this kind of settles down this whole offense. The fact that they went into Cleveland against that good defense and were able to get that win, and convincingly as well, will settle things down. Now that both Dak and CD are tied down, that connection will remain very integral to the success of this offense. But looking at CeeDee Lamb's stats, like I said, 5 catches, 10 targets, 61 yards, 13.6 fantasy points. So, like I said, not impressive, but still kind of serviceable enough to the point where you know he will improve. And this weekend against the Saints, I think CeeDee Lamb will see a lot of. The Saints, kind of a team in transition in the secondary as well, so look out for CeeDee Lamb to be someone to really elevate his game. This Cowboys offense could just be getting started, really. I'm really excited to see, now that the tension has dissipated with the offense. They still have the tension looming concerning Micah Parsons, but I think that right now, this is who is going to be the X factor for this offense. CeeDee Lamb deserves to be number 3 on this list. Coming on at number 2, another guy who didn't have a quote-unquote impressive game for where he's seen in this league, but still, he's going to be one of those, I'll call him an I'll-be-there receiver. He's always there to bail out someone who is learning in this offense. That is Justin Jefferson combined with Sam Darnold. I love what Justin Jefferson purportedly is the word, told Sam Darnold during training camp. He said, "I'll always be there for you. Look for me to get open." And this game was not his prettiest game by any means, but it does show what Justin Jefferson is. He's a security blanket. He's a number 1 receiver as well. 4 catches, 6 targets, 59 yards, 1 TD, 15.9 fantasy points. Again, pretty pedestrian for someone who has such lofty standards of himself, and I think that's kind of because of what this team could be, but it's also kind of a diagnosis of where this team is. Sam Darnold was willing to explore his options in this game. He wasn't necessarily focused on getting Justin Jefferson the ball. He was focused on getting everyone involved. And that's what I loved about what I saw from the Minnesota Vikings. Justin Jefferson will get his, but Sam Darnold, I would really appreciate that he knew that he could explore different options, and if nothing was there, Justin Jefferson would make himself available. And so that's what I love about Justin Jefferson. He may not have pretty fantasy stat lines, but he's always going to be someone who can be relied upon, both in real life and fantasy, to get the necessary production you need. He's very efficient in that regard. But I think the number 1 receiver, you all know, Tyreek Hill. And this proved that no matter what events transpired that day, no one could truly contain a player like Tyreek Hill. Yes, the first half was kind of disappointing, kind of quiet. As Shep Easy's sweet spot says, without Addison, JJ will get more defensive attention. Yes, fantastic point. I completely forgot about the Addison injury. So yes, Jettis will get a lot of attention from defenses, but at the end of the day, I'm not necessarily worried about it for the overall profile of the Minnesota Vikings or for what Justin Jefferson brings to the table. You'll always find ways to make himself available. And if he has to shorten some of his routes, if he's, covered to the point where he can't get vertical, then that's fine. Sam Darnold will find him, and it won't necessarily hurt or hinder the Minnesota Vikings offense. But that's a fascinating point to kind of dissect because, Justin Jefferson does still require, even with different pieces around him that are, when they're healthy, can provide offense like Addison, like Hawkinson. But at the end of the day, Justin Jefferson will find a way. But let's get back to Tyreek Hill because no one can truly contain this man. Yes, the first half was not pretty for him or the Dolphins offense as a whole, but in the second half, one play can change everything, and that 80-yard bomb really settled him down. And I think in this game against Buffalo, he's about to go off because the questions about the Buffalo secondary are really up in the air. So many injuries coming off that game against Arizona. So look for Tyreek Hill to wreak havoc in this one. Although he only has 366 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns in 7 career games against the Bills, this game certainly feels like he'll have a big say in that. and that will come in the future when we talk about some prop bets. But let me know what you guys think in the comments about this list. Again, not necessarily mine, but I just wanted to show you a comprehensive, well thought out list and analyze it myself in terms of who the top 5 really are. And these guys truly deserve to be on this list, in my opinion. But right after this quick break, we'll be going over the tight end rankings and which tight ends really impressed pundits and my overall analysis concerning their findings. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again to keep on making yourselves availed to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features on YouTube. You guys have been doing an excellent job at that. Continue making this show as interactive as possible. I want to hear all your opinions, your analyses, your questions, your comments, your concerns to make this show better, and everything you do for it is greatly appreciated. Without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of today's show and transition from wide receivers to tight ends in terms of fantasy rankings and where they stand after a week of NFL action. Now, with tight ends, a lot of controversy surrounding. A lot of different ways you can look at this position group, like I said, leading up to the NFL season and the fantasy football season as a whole. But these top 5 guys really represent how versatile the tight end market truly is, and how week by week each of these guys, no matter their age, no matter their team, can really step up and be the TE1 week in, week out. So without further ado, let's look into them. Starting off at number 5, a guy who kind of had a disappointing game through no fault of his own, because it really was Jordan Mason's game to shine. But George Kittle, I don't think he'll always be this disappointing. It's just that, Kyle Shanahan can be so varied in his game plans, much like a Ben Johnson. And I think that in all of the NFC, those two teams have so many different ways to beat you. They're the only two teams where I know they can either have a very run-dominant game plan or pass-happy game plan, and they can find ways to win. So it's just the lay of the land here. It's just a week-by-week thing. But George Kittle will still have a lot of targets in this offense. 4 catches on his 5 targets, 40 yards, 8 fantasy points. And not necessarily the worst of days for George Kittle. It's just that, the San Francisco 49ers, at the end of the day, had the most mouths to feed out of anyone in the NFL on the offensive side of the ball. And it's what you do with them, yes. But George Kittle can take up so many different roles in this offense. He can block, he can catch, he can do so many things. He's potent in the red zone, he's potent in the open field. So this time will come, and he deserves a place in the top 5 fantasy tight ends, potentially week in, week out. But again, it's the 49ers. Any given week, they could have any given game plan, and they'll be fine with it. And we just have to live with the results. As thank you for the tip, Meryl Shepard. Thank you for the tip, Mom. So, again, George Kittle, week in, week out, will prove that he deserves the spot at least in the top 5 tight ends. But number 4, a little bit more youth, like I said. It's the youth movement against the old heads. And Dalton Kincaid will lead that movement, but this weekend was not his week for sure. Only one catch on 11 yards, 2.1 fantasy points. So as you can see, not the best of starts to his sophomore season in the NFL. But I think that game against Arizona really came down to Josh Allen saying, okay, I'll do it all myself, and I will lead this team to the promised land. And the way he did it was that, yes, he could have had more targets for Dalton Kincaid. He could have spread the ball around a little bit more. But he understood that anyone at any given time will be able to step up. He had touchdown passes to Mac Hollins and Khalil Shakir. So think about that. Think about how Josh Allen will now want to view this offense, and think about how it could affect a guy like Dalton Kincaid. Because Dalton Kincaid was technically, quote-unquote, even though he's not a wide receiver, the wide receiver too in that offense last year, if you really think about it. He was someone who really had a lot of targets and a lot of volume and depth of those targets as a result. So on a week-by-week basis, I think that Dalton Kincaid will be very volatile in where he stands in people's minds, but he's still a fascinating tight end, especially in a team that could use him in certain situations more often than not. So look out for Dalton Kincaid's stats to only go up from here. This game is not an indictment of him, and much like Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's still an important facet to his offense as well. But at number 3, this is a guy who will always be a surprisingly quiet game, but I kind of expected it, seeing as to how the Kansas City Chiefs are also one of those teams that can spread the ball around and not necessarily matter who catches it. Travis Kelce. 3 catches, 34 yards, 6.4 fantasy points. So, as you can see, as Quinn Lenardi, a trade, I love this, or a decision to make for his fantasy team rather, T. Higgins or Amari Cooper rest of the season. This is a weird one, isn't it? Because both of these guys are two guys who, in many different ways, can start to decline this season. And what I mean by that is they can start to have certain issues potentially off the field start to seep into their on-the-field play. Let's start with T. Higgins, because T. Higgins is definitely a weird situation. He had the injury right in this past game, and he also has the whole contract. Well, not necessarily a contract dispute, but worries over the future and what his contract in the future will look like, whether he's or not he's a Cincinnati Bengal, because he's only on the franchise tag this year. Let's be clear. And then Amari Cooper, my concern with him is not just, age, but will this offense even ever get going? So when you look at it that way, it's mainly about, whether or not you think that T. Higgins, when he gets back, will be focused on getting more targets in this offense, or will he let what happened in the offseason linger? And even though Jamar Chase has that same worry, I still think that this offense is a huge opportunity for T. Higgins in it. Whereas Amari Cooper, I don't really trust this offense to really get going that often. Even if during the middle of the season, Deshaun Watson either magically becomes who he was in Texas, Houston, or Jameis Winston somehow gets the starting job in the middle of the season, I don't see how Amari Cooper is an appealing fantasy option anymore. And to top it all off, he's getting up there in age. I believe he's 32 years old. So you have to consider that. As tap to learn, I don't know what exactly this means, but Deshaun isn't. I believe you're alluding to potentially Deshaun isn't going anywhere, perhaps. But it has to be considered at some point. The guy isn't necessarily, or Deshaun isn't magically doing anything. And I agree with that sentiment. So I think that T. Higgins is the quote-unquote safer option, but I still don't feel good about either of those guys. But if that's the decision for you, then be that as it may. And it is what it is, because neither of these guys right now are in appealing situations for their futures. But T. Higgins just seems quote-unquote better off, in my humble opinion. But that was a fantastic question. Keep them coming. Very interesting comment. Let's get back to the tight ends and Travis Kelce, because he is someone who will potentially pretend to be quieter in this offense, but he still is someone who Patrick Mahomes knows he can rely upon. He still is someone who Patrick Mahomes, in the back of his mind, knows is one of his favorite targets. They've had the most experience in this offense together. And while Rashee Rice looked like a wide receiver one this past week, and while Xavier Worthy, with the limited touches he had, made the most of them, and while Marquise Hollywood-Brown hasn't even played, Travis Kelce is the biggest X factor in this offense. If all of those guys are somehow quiet and they're being held for next to nothing, that Travis Kelce can really open things up under the middle and do his magic. But that's something to be considered. And number 2, another guy who kind of had a disappointing start to his season, also in the younger kind of sect of tight ends, but Trey McBride. How to make sense of him? He had 5 catches, 30 yards, 8 fantasy points. Now this is a guy who a lot of people are expecting to be one of the focal points of the Cardinals offense, but he really wasn't. And what shocked me was that even though I was impressed by the Cardinals' red zone offense and the many different ways that Kyler went about trying to get the ball to some weapons like Michael Wilson, handing it off to James Conner, who's fantastic at the goal line in those situations. Trey McBride, I don't necessarily know if it's trying to get him open, trying too hard to get him open, or in the back of his mind, Kyler not wanting to disappoint people in terms of Marvin Harrison Jr., but there seems to be a disconnect between what Trey McBride can do and how the Cardinals are going about doing it. Because yes, there are many different ways that this offense can improve, and there are many different players who can improve in this offense because of Kyler Murray's presence. But at the end of the day, Trey McBride is someone who I kind of feel fell flat, but can improve still. Don't let this be kind of a knock on him just because in a game where Kyler Murray was fully healthy, he did not get as many targets as you expected. And against the Rams, expect for him to have a better game. I think that he'll find it easier against the Rams secondary to get open a little bit more often, and he can be a security blanket in that game for Kyler Murray. But number 1, Sam Laporta. Let's talk about him, because there's a lot of contentious talk about a guy like Sam Laporta becoming the new tight end 1. He also, much like Amon-Ra St. Brown, did not have an impressive game here. 4 catches, 5 targets, 45 yards, 8.5 fantasy points. And he's someone who I was talking about as being a tight end 1, but not having the best of tight end 1 seasons. And I feel like that could be the case again this year. He's not someone who's going to get pretty numbers. He wins ugly. He's a part of the ugly nature of how the Detroit Lions construct their offense. And so Sam Laporta will do whatever is necessary to help this Lions offense, but he's not necessarily going to do it to the point where you're completely excited. As Andre says, I got likely off waivers and Kelce's my starter. I like that tight end room for you, Andre, in fantasy purposes. I think likely we'll get a lot of targets in this offense. I don't know what Mark Andrews was, as saw Laporta blocking a lot. Yeah, that's another big concern because Laporta can become more of a blocking tight end. Although they don't necessarily need it up front, I think the Lions' O-line is fine without him. But it is something to take note of. But the tight end room they're talking about, as Andre has another question. Keep them coming, man. Question, would you trade Kelce for McBride straight up? Ooh, that's a rough one. Because I think I still have hope for McBride in this Cardinals offense. I still think McBride is someone who can be very potent in the red zone for them. And that game was not indicative of what I think Trey McBride can be in this Cardinals offense should they get more red zone trips in the future. Travis Kelce, there is concern about him. There is concern about what he will look like in this offense. But at the end of the day, I still think Travis Kelce will have more high upside later in the year, whereas Trey McBride is kind of a cohesion thing, where you kind of have to work your way up to solid week-by-week Trey McBride performances in fantasy. Whereas Travis Kelce, I have more faith in producing bigger stat lines more often, so to speak. So I wouldn't necessarily trade Kelce for McBride straight up. But to your point about your tight end room, I like this tight end room as well. Likely as insurance, Kelce as your starter, you're all set. But overall, getting back to this overarching sentiment of this list, I like this list, but I think that it just goes to show that so many different tight ends are in different offenses. They have different situations to worry about in their offenses. Any given week, I feel like this could change in pundits' minds, in my minds. And before we go to the break, I will address another question that Andre left for me. If I were to trade Kelce for McBride, ask for another player with him, I think you could, because Travis Kelce still holds a lot of weight in fantasy leagues, but it also depends on what position you're looking for. Because if you're looking for a wide receiver, I could see it make a lot of sense, but if you're not necessarily looking for a position of note, then, or player of note for that matter, then I would be kind of hesitant about this trade. But that being said, if you are willing to look at his team and say, someone here outside of Trey McBride can also help me, then I think it would be an interesting trade. But we do have to take a quick break. Continue with the comments, though, guys. They have been incredible. But we'll take a quick break, and when we return, we talk about updated Heisman odds. I promise I will get to your comment, Andre, right after this quick break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Before we get into our third segment here on today's show, I do want to address a comment that Andre left right before the break. I promised I was going to get to it. I got an offer. Now he's not talking about his trade. He's talking about an offer he received, which is very interesting. I'd be giving K9, Chris Godwin, and Jamar Chase for Justin Jefferson and Josh Jacobs. And he says Pacheco, keeping my back of my mind, is my RB1. Now, I think this is a very fascinating offer, and I honestly would take it, even though you're losing a lot. Because at the end of the day, Jacobs and Pacheco are a very balanced running back room, my humble opinion. Because they're not guys who you would think would be like the superstars. They're not the Saquons of the world. They're not the... I'll throw Derrick Henry's name out there, even though I don't like him in the Baltimore Ravens offense, but the Derrick Henrys of the world. They're not those guys, but their balanced production will get you enough points. As RGQ says, any news on Josh Jacobs? What's wrong with him? Anyone know the finer details? This is news to me, actually, RGQ. Thank you for talking about this, because I do not know what is wrong with Josh Jacobs. I only know about the whole Jordan Love situation, but if anyone has any news, I will be glad to hear about and comment on Josh Jacobs as well, with any subsequent news about him, because this is news to me. I'm just hearing about this in real time. But going back to the trade as well, because if anyone does have any information about Justin Jefferson and Josh Jacobs, my whole opinion about this trade could potentially change. But still, looking at this trade for what it was, as Andre says, haven't heard anything, so that certainly alleviates some of my opinion, as RGQ did say, didn't practice today with an apparent undisclosed injury. So, with that up in the air, maybe my whole opinion about this trade potentially changes here, because thank you for this information, RGQ. This is very informative for this trade, because right now, I like this trade, but with the volume of players you're losing, and when I drop Godwin, Andre says I can get McConkey off waivers. Now that's an interesting proposition as well. If you're really strategizing with this one, there's so many different levels here. My mind is completely blown with this. But there's so many different levels to this, because this is a very interesting strategy that Andre could be employing here. He's saying he wants to drop Godwin after this trade is over to get McConkey. So if that's your strategy, that's a very interesting strategy, because then you have a proven wide receiver one, and I actually liked McConkey. He did get that touchdown in that game against the Raiders. So I really think that when the Chargers do pass the football, look for Ladd McConkey to get a lot of targets. As Andre says again, if I trade Godwin, I meant haha. So once he trades Godwin, he's going to pick up another receiver in Ladd McConkey. And I like that idea. I like the fact that you're looking ahead, thinking about the different bases, but that Josh Jacobs injury is very interesting. So I want to say I wish I were non-committal on this, but for now, once we hear more about the Jacobs injury, because I hadn't heard about it at all before this, I do believe that that trade could be a good one for you. But we still have to hear a lot of different details about it as well. But it's also a very interesting strategy that Andre brings up, in that he could trade someone away and look to the future in terms of the waiver wire to acquire different pieces. But I do want to get into, thank you guys for all the craziness, I appreciate it, but I do want to get into my third segment of the day and talk about the Heisman odds. We haven't really talked about college football a lot with all the chaos that's been going on around the NFL. And I do want to step into the world of college football a little bit, because I'm really fascinated by the start of the college football season. I don't know if many of you out there are college football fans, but I really want to talk about these top 5 Heisman favorites, because it has drastically changed, as Andre already has his pick for Heisman. Jackson Dart, Heisman, we'll get to that in a bit. And Tap to Learn also adds Jacobs was limited, not a DNP, so probably minor. That's another information. So, Andre, to your point about your trade, I would do it, but also be wary of what Josh Jacobs' future holds. But let us get to this Heisman odds update here, as Andre already has an opinion about it. Now I'll get to that opinion as well. Let's start off going down from 5 to 1 with the current Heisman odds. Starting off at number 5, Jalen Milroe. Now, the thing about Jalen Milroe is, I watched the latter stages of the USF game. I think that Jalen Milroe has improved in the sense that he's not necessarily pushing too hard. But at the end of the day, they very well could have and should have, in my humble opinion, lost this game. And it's mainly because of the fact that Jalen Milroe did not get going for large portions of it. He's still, in some ways, very raw in how he thinks. But I do believe that there's real upside to him. At plus 1,200, he is kind of a long shot. And I kind of want to fade him after what I saw. And the offensive line now gives me a lot of trepidations. But at the end of the day, he's a very exciting player, at the very least in college football, who always will be in the conversation about college football talk in the future. So Jalen Milroe was someone who I'm really excited to see in SEC play, to see if he actually has improved to the point where I'm more confident in him as a true Heisman Trophy contender. But right now, after that USF game and after how USF for large portions of the game exploited that offensive line, I really have to see what the future holds for this new look Alabama team. Then at number 4, as RGQ says, oh right, my bad, or the article wrong. No worries, RGQ. You are a very integral part of today's show, because I would not have been well equipped to talk about the Jacobs injury because I had no idea about it. So thank you all for your comments about the status of Josh Jacobs for this week. Going back to my segment about Heisman odds here, because I really want to get into college football. I know you guys are really excited about fantasy football, but let's get back to the subject at hand here. And number 4, I'm going back to Andre's comment because this is his guy, Jackson Dart. At plus 900, this is where things get interesting, right? Because Jackson Dart has by far looked like perhaps the most impressive college football player and quarterback, at the very least, in all of college football. And I think that will continue because Ole Miss will be in a lot of shootouts in SEC play where they're going to rely on the arm talent of Jackson Dart to get them wins. With that being said, I'm really concerned that he's not going to have, the high-profile wins that some of these players higher up in these rankings will have at the end of the season because Ole Miss, they have a tough schedule. They play Georgia, they're lucky to miss Texas, and they play Alabama this season. So Jackson Dart will very much be in the spotlight for those games. And it's really telling that the first two games, yes, he put up big numbers, but they were against much more inferior opponents than some of these guys higher on this list. So keep that in mind for Jackson Dart. He will be in the conversation because of the conference he plays in and because of the high-stakes games he will be playing in as a result. But as of right now, he is someone who I'm going to have to wait and see because his odds could be very volatile as the weeks go on. So Jackson Dart, take him with a grain of salt. It's a very bold and interesting pick, Andre, and I wouldn't mind it because he kind of came out of nowhere. So I would have liked that aspect of it, but for now, I'm a little bit wary of him. And number 3, though, this is a guy who also kind of rose through the ranks unannounced a little bit and truly has an interesting case at this current moment to be the Heisman winner, Cam Ward. He has somewhat of a high-profile win. We'll have to see how Florida plays out because they have one of the toughest, if not the toughest schedule in recent memory in college football history. So that win will have to play itself out. But right now, Cam Ward looks like one of the most comfortable quarterbacks in the country. And sometimes that's what a team like Miami needs. For many years, they've been trying to find the answer, and Cam Ward might just be it. He just seems so poised and composed and nonchalant. It's almost like it's coming easy to him being the quarterback at Miami. And with that receiving core, with guys who are available to him, and with the impression that the O-line has made this year so far, I really like Cam Ward. That defense will be called into question in ACC play, but right now, looking at the ACC, there feels like really no one that can truly contend with what Miami brings to the table. We'll have to see in real time, but Florida State, Clemson clearly look very vulnerable this year. And so the wide open nature of the ACC could lead Cam Ward to have a quote-unquote easy path to the Heisman. But at plus 800, he's sitting right where he feels kind of comfortable, like just right candidate for if either of these top two guys falter because they also have very tough schedules ahead of them. But at number 2, feels like the most comfortable pick here, Carson Beck. At plus 900, he's not necessarily the sexiest option in terms of fantasy odds. He's not someone who's eye-popping. His story is not one in which you can get behind him that much as someone who has sat and waited and finally gotten his thing. But what I will give him is that as a pure pocket passer, as an accurate guy, he's going to have a lot of opportunities to put up big numbers in games of consequence, most importantly. He's still playing Texas. He could play Texas as much as 3 times this year. He could play them in the regular season, the SEC championship game, and if they were to meet again in the national championship, or however they're seeded. So Carson Beck will be playing in a lot of big games. He can still play Alabama. He can still play new SEC member Oklahoma as well. So there's a lot of opportunity for Carson Beck here. With that being said, the number 1 guy, who you guys probably are tired of me talking about, has a storyline. I don't really know how much storyline also plays into the winner of the Heisman race, but this guy really has had quite the journey ahead of him at number 1. And so, with all due respect to Carson Beck, who is still an incredible QB, deserves a lot of plaudits for what he's done with this Georgia team. The number 1 guy right now is Quinn Ewers. Let's talk about the whole maturation storyline here. To see where Quinn Ewers was in year 1, where he was injured in that game against Alabama, and who knows what would have happened in that game had he stayed in it, much like the Colt McCoy question as well. But as a Texas fan, I digress. Getting to the point where he is now, where in the past 2 seasons, in consecutive week 2s, he has gone into a quote-unquote superior or considered superior for longer stretches of time team's house and taken them down in such dominant fashion. And not only that, but with different teams, understanding how complicated Sark's game plans can be, and really understanding them to the point where he's putting up big numbers. I think he's the rightful at plus 550 favorite for the Heisman Trophy. Until, I see him against a Georgia, and maybe even on a neutral field against, say, an Ole Miss even. Quinn Ewers right now just feels like the guy. He feels like he has a story behind him. He may not have the hype surrounding him like Caleb Williams did, or former quarterbacks in the past. Maybe Johnny Manziel comes to mind. But his story about his maturation to get to this point where he's competing at a high level against teams that Texas perhaps would have lost to in the past. Quinn Ewers certainly deserves a lot of plaudits, and I wouldn't be surprised if in New York he's anointed the newest Heisman Trophy winner. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Andre did leave his opinion, and I wouldn't be too mad at a Jackson Dart Heisman win either, but Quinn Ewers is my guy. I followed his college career for many years now, so I really hope that it's him. But let me know what you think in the comments as well, because it's not just about me, it's about you as well. But we'll take a short break, and coming up, we turn our attention to Thursday Night Football, tomorrow night's game, a very important divisional game between the Bills and the Dolphins, and an overall betting preview. We'll be right back to talk about that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Like I said, coming up right now, we are shifting gears from the world of college back to the NFL and looking ahead, getting an early look into tomorrow night's game, Thursday Night Football, between the Buffalo Bills and the Miami Dolphins. Now, I know what you're thinking. This game probably will not be as important in the long run as it sounds, but I still think it is. This is perhaps one of the most consequential Week 2 games you'll ever see. Because if you believe that the AFC East is still Buffalo and Miami, based off whether or not, the Jets can get going or what you saw in that game against San Fran, then this game is very important because of seeding implications, because of where you play, most importantly, in the playoffs, should both of these teams get there. So it's going to be a very fun one to dissect, especially in betting terms as well. There's a lot that could happen in this game. Let's start off with the overall money lines and betting lines as well. So right now, with a little bit of movement as the week has gone on in the betting lines, Miami now favored by 2.5, and their money line sits at minus 110. Buffalo's is even, and the over-under did change from 50.5 points to 48.5 points. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the consequences of this game. Because right now, it certainly feels like, based off both teams' performances, this is either going to be a shootout or a Dolphins blowout, if you want a bold take here. Those are the two outcomes I see most likely happening. Let's talk about the first one, because the shootout can always happen in a game like this, can always happen in an interdivisional game, especially a game like this where you have two quarterbacks who kind of have two different styles but could still affect games in different ways. For Josh Allen, it's about taking over himself. It's about making plays out of nothing. For Tua, it's just being the guy who gets the ball to speedy weapons who can get open down the field. And so, with these two different philosophies about playing the game on offense, you would kind of think that this is a shootout. But then let's look at the defensive play, because that's what I think this game will ultimately come down to. How both of these offenses match up against these defenses. The Dolphins' defense perhaps was one of the most impressive this past weekend. Yes, it was against the Jacksonville Jaguars team that's still not a finished product, in my opinion. I still think, even though Brian Thomas Jr. had a beautiful touchdown and Trevor Lawrence, had some moments, it was not by any means a perfect game, and they could have most likely won it. As Andre says, he's going back to his trade analysis, so you like Jacobs more than K9. I wouldn't necessarily say that's the part of the trade that really gets my goat, because I love K9 as a Seattle Seahawks fan. But I think when I look at that overall trade, it makes sense. It makes sense to package a guy like K9, even though it's hard to let him go. As Andre also says, I really want to go for Kyren Williams. I think he can finish top 5. That's yet another guy. I personally don't say that as K9's injury bad. I did not personally see any injury to K9 where I'm at that point where I'm concerned about when he's playing. Says Andre as well. A lot of comments from Andre. Keep them coming, even though it's kind of getting it a little bit out of hand. A little bit. I'm trying to process a lot. To go to your point about Kyren Williams, though, he's a guy that I personally do not necessarily have a lot of hope for, because it was just a one-season sample of him being dominant. But he still can hold a lot of weight in this offense, especially with the Puka Nacua injury. A lot of different ways, Getting back to Andre's point about K9 as well, I personally didn't see any point in the game where he looked uncomfortable against the Broncos, to the point where I would be concerned about any sort of injury. I don't necessarily know if he was even injured in this game either way. So let me know about that as well, because I personally, watching the game, did not see anything that would strike fear into my heart about whether or not K9 is healthy. But also getting back to the Jacobs more than K9 point, I love K9 as a biased Seattle fan now. But in that trade, it makes sense to let him go, because I think that you're getting more balance as well. And if you do plan to pick up McConkey on waivers, like you said, then that also makes your wide receiver room deep enough to the point where I really like it as well. But let's get back to Thursday Night Football as well, because this game could also have a lot of fantasy implications as well. Because at the end of the day, like I said, it will come down to the offenses versus the defenses. And then, like I said, the Dolphins defense was perhaps the most impressive. And we're talking about, yes, maybe it's the overall non-cohesion of the Jacksonville Jaguars. It pays testament that everyone is back healthy. Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips, and Jalen Ramsey are now all playing at the same time. So that's a big win for the Miami Dolphins in the first place. But also, look to the other side. Look at the Bills defense. Yes, a lot of people are very high on the Arizona Cardinals offense, but not to the point where they were actually leading for large portions of that game against the Buffalo Bills team that, yes, lost a lot of offensive production, but a lot of people still have high expectations for. But it also is the injury crisis that befell their cornerback room, especially in their secondary. Taron Johnson's out. Bryce Hall's out. And when you think about the Bills, the best part about their defense is that they can heavily rotate at every single position on the field. And losing that and having to call up practice squad, rookie says Andre, further to that point, Buffalo is super banged up. I still think that the Dolphins' blow is not so far-fetched at this point, because of the fact that with all that speed, now this is a game where I actually like Miami a lot, and not only betting purposes, but also in fantasy purposes, because this is just a game where they can have a lot of fun with it. They can exploit the Buffalo Bills' depleted secondary, and this could be a bloodbath. But I'm giving Buffalo the benefit of the doubt because they are a tough team, if anything. They did come back against the Cardinals. Josh Allen still has the most moxie out of any quarterback. He will do whatever it takes to get that win, especially in this game. So it's ultimately up to you. In terms of over-under, I think this is super easy. I think it will go over either way. If it's a Dolphins blowout or if it's a shootout, I think this will go either way. I will take the over in this game. Now, I think that as Andre says, who's your pick? I'll get to that in a little bit. This game is just so weird that it's a divisional game because the spread could have been much larger as well. I just want to speak to that point. I'm looking at the spread. Miami favored by 2.5 points. I believe they are the home team. But this spread definitely feels like it could have been bigger. I don't think Vegas took into account how depleted Buffalo is. And yes, Taron Johnson is just a nickel corner, and they still have guys like Benford and Rasul Douglas, who are very underrated secondary in their own right. But I still think this game, either way, will hit the over, whether it's an exciting game or a snooze fest. As to Andre saying and asking who my pick is, I'm going to pick Miami. I think that right now, I just feel like this game is leaning more and more towards them, and the Bills secondary isn't going to magically be able to rotate people in and out. So, that being said, I'm picking Miami. But I don't think it will be a blow, because Josh Allen is just a guy who I can't underestimate. Yes, there was concerns about his hand and wrist injury like I alluded to yesterday after that second rushing touchdown in that game. But, as Sheppy Sweet Sauce said, money line or spread, I would just take the money line here, to be honest with you. Because I don't think this game will really matter in terms of spread. I think that Miami would cover either way. And Andre, who do you like to score touchdowns? I do have a whole prop bet bid, but just to give it to you, I think that this is going to be a fun game. It's going to come down to the wire. I have Miami winning 31-27 on a late touchdown, to your point, Tyreek Hill. And that will kind of spoil a little bit of my prop bets segment. So, at the end of the day, I want it to be an exciting game, but I can definitely see a world where this could be a huge disappointment and Miami could run away with it. Continue letting me know what you think in the comments, but to Andre's point, we are, in this next segment, going to be looking at prop bets. But to kind of conclude this general betting preview, I think if you're a bettor, Thursday night football games are an opportunity to really, really deep dive into some popular bets here. I don't think this game is going to be indicative. It's a divisional game, let's be real. But there are some Thursday night games coming up on the schedule that can be really interesting in terms of betting. Get you some easy wins. As Blue Sea Turtle, thank you. I wanted to go to break, but I did want a comment from someone. So thank you, Blue Sea Turtle. Before we go to break, I got sent a trade in a PPR league. Do you think I should accept it? It is Garrett Wilson and Travis Etienne for Xavier Worthy and Bijan. I actually think you should accept it. I like Xavier Worthy a lot, and Bijan will not be as terrible as he was against a Steelers defensive front that's projected to be one of the best in the league. Whereas Garrett Wilson still needs to find that connection with Aaron Rodgers. I still believe in him. He was personally on my fantasy team, but at the end of the day, I still think it will take time. And Travis Etienne, man, was that fumble disappointing if you were had him in your fantasy roster. I think that, Travis Etienne is one of those interesting guys who you can't necessarily make heads or tails about in that Jacksonville offense. As Andre agrees with my sentiment here. And at the end of the day, Xavier Worthy and Bijan just have more excitement to them. Even though, Xavier Worthy's touches might not be the most. I expect Bijan Robinson to be better as well. So I would definitely accept that trade, especially in a PPR league. Thank you for this comment, but we do have to take a short break. Let me know what you guys think about this segment, particularly in the comments about Thursday Night Football, as we're going to be sticking with it for our final segment of today's show, where we talk about some prop bets. Andre already really excited for that segment, as I can see. So thank you guys for all your comments. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome to our final segment here on today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And like Andre alluded to, we're going to be talking about some nice prop bets for tomorrow night's game. There are a lot of interesting storylines with these prop bets as well, and a lot of really out there bets that I really liked as well. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Starting off with perhaps the chalk pick, let's say. Tyreek Hill anytime touchdown score. This one seems pretty easy to me. And minus 125. Taking advantage, if you're a player of Tyreek Hill's caliber, of that depleted secondary, is second nature. And he might not even have the best of games. He might be quiet like he was against Jacksonville. But one play can change the whole situation. One play will change that. And Mike McDaniel must be foaming at the mouth to have the opportunity to take advantage of this defense, because he probably won't get this opportunity ever again. As Andre, fantastic commenter today, my commenter of the day, if that was an award. Wilson for Rice. Isn't that crazy, Rice? I kind of want to offer it and see what the guy says, LOL. It is kind of crazy. I believe you're talking about Garrett Wilson and Rashee Rice. It is kind of crazy. I like that you're considering these very different trades. I love that you're taking advantage of the volatility of the market. But Wilson for Rice, I do want clarification whether you are getting Rice or he is getting Rice, because I do remember you saying that you had Rice, but I just want to double check with you. But I think that is a very crazy trade, because both of these guys are young guys, right? And both of these guys are trying to be the guy in their offense with two very experienced quarterbacks. So it's a very interesting trade. But then again, it's a one-for-one trade. You wouldn't be too mad about it later in the season if you look back on it in hindsight and be like, the Wilson for Rice trade, it won't necessarily get your goat later in the season. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that one of these guys could perform bad and it could lead to your detriment, but I don't necessarily think it will overwhelm your team negatively or positively. So it's still a trade that I respect, and I definitely respect the fact that the trade stems from a point of, as Andre clarifies, he beginning Rice. So yeah, I definitely think it's going to stem from a point of, you feeling bad about it, because either of these guys could be bad, either of these guys could be good, but it's not necessarily a consequence. But this one could, because he also talks about the stack of Chase Wilson more or Jefferson Wilson. I like Jefferson Wilson more. It's a simple one because of all the chaos of Chase and Wilson. I think that if you don't accept that trade and it's Jefferson and Wilson who you're comfortable with, then that would be the pick for me. But I do like the prospects of a Jefferson Rice stack right there. That one could be good, because both of those guys are guys who, yes, they might have some games where they might be a little bit off, but if they can maintain what they have going with their offenses, then that's a very potent fantasy wide receiver room right there. Let's talk about prop bets as well. Tyreek Hill, anytime TD score, book it. I think that's the simplest one, especially looking like what I said. Keep reiterating it. The Bills' depleted secondary. If you are more ambitious and you want a very crazy one as well, as Andre also says, I have Olave as well. I want to trade him. Now, that can go many ways, because Olave is not someone who I believe will have a good fantasy season. So you might have to package Olave with someone, and you might have to give up a lot more if you do feel like Rice is a guy that can really help your receiving room. I think that if you were to give up Chase and Olave, I wouldn't be mad at it, mainly because of Chase's contract situation, and I just don't think Olave has the same luster he had in the Saints offense as last year, because, as you saw, albeit against the Panthers, they utilized so many different weapons there. So, if you want to trade Olave, be my guest, because I think that he will be someone who I'm not as high on. Olave, Montgomery for a monster receiver or running back, says Andre. I think that could work, because both of those guys in a package deal could be more appealing than, say, just swapping like for like Olave for someone else. That could work a lot. And I think that with all your trades, I love what you're thinking about in the future. I love that you're really tinkering with different position groups, and I most like that you already like that. As Andre thanks me for all the help. Thank you for all the comments, Andre. You have been one of the better commenters of the day here on the show and of the week as well. I appreciate your engagement in the world of fantasy football. Really keeps me as well kind of updated on the pulse of different leagues around me. So thank you so much. Let's get into something that you also alluded to, the prop bets as well. If, like I said, you are of the ambitious type, Dalton Kincaid for the first touchdown, minus 1,500, is my bold bet that I really liked, was struck by, and wanted to bring to your attention. Another one, I think that this might be his ultimatum right here. Olave Montgomery for Cup, says Audrey as well. That could be interesting as well. I think that Cup definitely gives you value, at least for this couple of weeks. We'll have to see when Puka Nacua comes back how the target share will play out. But at the end of the day, I'm not mad at that trade. I'm not mad at anyone trying to experiment to better their team. And you have a solid team to really build around. So kudos to you for all the different trade options that you bring to my attention and for being ambitious in terms of what you are doing in the open market and fantasy. But Dalton Kincaid, in terms of prop betting, is someone who I think is not necessarily going to be a popular bet, as Bijan and Brees are so hard to get in his league. Says Andre, yeah, I think so too. It's always hard to get a running back in terms of, any league. I think that my running backs are also a weak point in my league as well. I have right now James Cook and DeAndre Swift, and I wish I didn't. But I think it will be hard for me to get someone really good because of the fact the running back market is a little bit more competitive and there's a little bit more margin for error negotiating with it, most importantly, in fantasy than, say, wide receivers. So I really like all the points you're making. They're all salient points that I love that are being brought to my attention because it really gives me an idea that you guys are really immersed in this show and it's really starting to, make an influence. So thank you so much, Andre. You have been fantastic today. But I do want to get to some exciting prop bets here. Dalton Kincaid, like I said, if you are an ambitious person, this could be a very appealing bet to you. But another appealing bet, and I hope this one goes through because, like I said, James Cook is on my fantasy team. 70 plus receiving yards or rushing yards for James Cook at plus 135. I think that Buffalo, their game plan dramatically shifts based off their defensive inconsistencies back to kind of this time of possession game. And I think that this kind of plays into Josh Allen's hands, but I still think that James Cook will have a big part. As Andre also says, A.J. Brown is another one I'm really considering for Chase. Another guy who I really, really like. Another guy who really showed his stuff in that game in Brazil. Really was the big play threat in that Philadelphia Eagles offense. I really think that a lot of people are underrating A.J. Brown, especially because of the versatility of the Philadelphia Eagles' overall offense. But at the end of the day, you do you, man. You seem to have a fascinating concept of what you want to do and how you want to leverage and value certain players. And I admire your insight into all of your negotiating tactics, all the ways that you're looking at different players and comparing them to others. So it's really fascinating to think about. And thank you so much yet again, Andre. But let's go over our final prop bets here of the day. Tua over 265.5 yards at minus 115. This one is also kind of appealing because of the secondary issues as well. Tua will want to distribute the ball downfield, get vertical more often. I feel like he was kind of reeled in, but in the second half, he went out and had, I believe, the most passing yards of the week last week. So look for Tua to continue that as well. Another comment I like Wilson. He's just starting the season with 2 elite corners, Ward and Snead, back to back. And Andre actually, he's calling into question my starting lineup as well. So, you know what? I had a couple more prop bets, but let's get into this to end the show because these are 2 topics that I really like. Alluding to Wilson, I believe he's having a slow start. I don't necessarily think it was all about the makeup of the Jets' offense. I really think that they had very much trouble moving the football against the potency of the 49ers defensive front. And this week, they're going to have to face L'Jarius Sneed, like you said. I'm not as worried about the Titans' offense. I'm not as worried about the Titans' defense and how it matches up against the Jets' offense as much as I was with San Fran. But it's something to keep your mind on because L'Jarius Sneed is an elite lockdown corner. But my starting lineup in fantasy this year, this is my starting week 1 lineup. I think this is relative to change week by week. So let me pull it up for you. This is the team that I personally drafted in my fantasy league. To end today's show, you can let me know in the comments in later shows because we have to keep an eye on the clock here. But this is my current fantasy team that I started in week 1. At the quarterback position, I had Brock Purdy. Didn't pay as much dividends. Had a decent game, but like I said, my running backs, James Cook and DeAndre Swift, I want to really get rid of them. I started looking into my running back room. My wide receivers, I really like, but obviously weren't up to stuff this week. And Amon-Ra St. Brown and Garrett Wilson. My tight end, another guy who we talked about and wasn't up to snuff, Dalton Kincaid. And then in my flex position, I have DJ Moore. Hopefully he develops that rapport with his experience as a Chicago Bear in the recent past with Caleb Williams. My defense is Pittsburgh. Really like what they did against Atlanta this week. Keep it up with them. My kicker is Cameron Dicker. I love Dicker the kicker. Texas guy. One of the best kickers in the league. Becoming one of the best kickers. My bench, Zamir White. Disappointing start. I thought I really struck out rich with him because a lot of people liked him in fantasy purposes. The receivers are crazy. Thank you for the comment. My bench, though, I have Rashee Rice. Is it a 12-man? Says Andre. I believe that it is a 12-man. It is also a PPR league. I think this is ESPN, as Andre also says. Do you like any Keon Coleman props? I did have Keon Coleman props. Keon Coleman over 3.5 receptions, minus 110. As he also comments on my receivers as well. But Keon Coleman, thanks for that comment as well. I think that Keon Coleman will get a lot of opportunities underneath in this offense. But to conclude today's show with the rest of my fantasy team, Cole Kmet as well. Not the best backup tight end, but a guy who I really like. Xavier Legette, honestly, I think the Panthers offense could do some things, but it was a pretty bad pick on my part. Then Jaleel McLaughlin and Kamani Vidal around on my bench as well. Let me continue knowing what you guys think in the comments, but we do have to end this show. Thank you for all your comments. Andre, you were fantastic today. But that will just about do it for the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I have been Chris Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to the network as a whole. Also, consider guys been doing an incredible job. I'm going to tip a donation or super chat, super things, super stickers features on YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow, same time as always, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.